Hey, I'm Paul Rabalais, and in this video we're going to talk about whether you should leave money or leave a bequest to your grandchildren. So I'm Paul Rabalais. I'm an estate planning attorney. I help our clients all around Louisiana get and keep their legal affairs in order. A lot has been written on how to leave it to your grandkids if you want to leave it to your grandkids. But not much really has been written or talked about as to whether it's a good idea, whether you should leave an inheritance to your grandchildren. So let me just tell you my story, and then we'll dig into some of the pros and cons and what our clients have told us over the years. And I hope that it gives you some guidance on how you'll structure things, the right way for your family. These are big decisions. So my grandfather worked for an oil company, but he died at age, I think he was 42. I never knew him. He died in 1939. But my grandmother, she passed away in 1973. I was 8 years old. And she, provided for her 4 children, but she also provided for, I think, what was her 13 grandchildren, one of which was me. So at age 8, I received an inheritance of some shares of stock. And so over the years, that, helped me made it a little easier for me to do some things like, get my education and go to law school and get a master's degree in tax law. And then, of course, working for the law firm, but probably earlier than I maybe could have had I not received a little bit of a cushion. I started my own law practice, had kids, bought a house, had a little bit of a cushion to, put a down payment on a house. So for me, I think it was a positive thing. I'm not sure, because if I think about, if my grandparents had not done that and they had just left everything to their kids, I certainly wouldn't have received an inheritance at 8 years old. I wouldn't have anything really until this year at age 54 when my mother passed away a few months ago. So I think that was a good thing. Now, I'm pretty sure it didn't work out that way for all of the other of the 13 grandchildren. I think, some spent it and it's gone. And quite frankly, if I had not received an inheritance at a young age, how would I have turned out? Would it maybe have motivated me a little bit to work even harder and be more productive because I didn't have that cushion? Or I don't know, but I think in general it worked out kind of okay and fine for me for what that's worth. But that's kind of my story in full disclosure. Okay, so with that and with having had 30 years of client conversations where they've talked to me and given me their thoughts about whether they just leave it all to the kids or they carve out some for the grandkids. This is what I've heard over the years. And I realize some people have even other objectives to leave things to charity or to non-family members. But for many, in kind of the traditional family where Grandpa and Grandpa, maybe they have 2, 3, 4 kids, maybe they have, 6, 7, 8, 10 grandkids, who knows? There's often a decision, do we just leave it to the kids or do we provide something for the grandkids? Maybe not as much for the grandkids as for the kids, but do we leave something for the grandkids? So the client conversations that I've had, the ones who typically do provide for the grandkids, I usually hear the grandparents say something like this: well, we're really close to our grandkids and we want to acknowledge them. So let's leave, and they'll come up with a number, maybe $25,000 to each of their grandchildren when the grandparents pass away, and then they'll leave everything else, whatever remains, the larger portion of the estate, to the kids. So sometimes they do it just to, acknowledge the grandkids. Others say, well, I want to make sure my grandkids get a college education, so let's leave a bequest to the grandchildren so they have an opportunity to get a college education. Other people just say, well, I want my grandkids to I want it to be a little easier for them to get a head start on their lives as they're getting married, and maybe they'll need a down payment for a house. It'd be great if I could leave them an inheritance, $10,000, $25,000, $50,000, 1% of the estate, 2% of the estate, whatever it might be, to each of our grandchildren so that it's a little easier for them. And other people have another reason why they leave it to the grandkids. Some people say, my kids, they blow every penny that they get, and I want to make sure my grandchildren are going to get something from me, so I want to make sure I leave a bequest to my grandchildren, because if I just leave it to the kids, it'll never get to the grandkids, because my children, and sometimes they say my children, and sometimes they say my children and their spouses, they're very financially irresponsible. I want to make sure I leave something specifically to the grandkids. So those are some of the reasons that I hear why people do carve out something to leave it to the grandkids. Now, the ones who don't, well, they'll often say right, wrong, or indifferent. They'll say something like, well, let's just, we feel comfortable leaving it all to our kids, and our kids will take care of our grandkids. I'm not so sure if that's right. I mean, it may never get to the grandkids under that scenario. At least in the best case scenario, it may not get to the grandkids until the kids die. But often when I see money going to kids, I don't see them sharing it with their kids. But nonetheless, that's what we hear. Another reason they don't leave a bequest to the grandkids is they say something like, we don't know how our grandkids will turn out, and we don't want them to blow it. Our grandkids right now, we've got our oldest one is 14 and our youngest grandchild is 3. We don't know how they're going to turn out. We don't want to leave anything to our grandkids. So we hear that. And we'll talk in a minute about how to leave things to the grandkids, which I spoke of earlier in the video. And then other people might say, well, heck, my grandparents didn't leave me anything, so I don't see any reason to leave a bequest to our grandkids. Kind of the old, based on my own experiences, that's what I'm going to do in the future. So, and none of that is right and none of that is wrong. And maybe some of it's right, actually. But, and then what I don't like to hear when I'm working with a family and they're trying to figure out how to leave things is they ask me the question that I kind of dread. Paul, what do most people do? And that's really not the right question, because just because maybe 80% of the people out there just leave it to their kids, and maybe only 20% of the people out there carve out something for the grandkids, that doesn't make those 20% wrong. So this is one of those areas where you don't want to base your decision based on what most people do. These are decisions that you have to make regardless of what the majority does. The majority may not necessarily be right in all these circumstances. So some people ask about, well, are there any tax consequences to leaving things to the grandkids that we need to know about that might factor in these decisions? And the answer is not really. With the estate tax exemption so high, unless you're in that 10, 20 million plus range, at least under our current estate tax law, there really isn't a need to try to skip a generation. And yes, we have a generation skipping transfer tax, but some people, particularly back when the estate tax was hefty and it applied to many more people, they'd want to leave things to the grandchildren so those assets wouldn't get taxed again when the children die. But and there's a tax issue. If you do name your grandchildren as beneficiaries of an IRA, their required distributions will be lesser than your children's required distributions will be if they are the beneficiaries of your IRA. But nonetheless, tax is going to have to be paid on those accounts by somebody at some point. So that's not a real big issue, although some people say it is. All right, and then the how do you leave it to them? Well, I think grandparents fear that if they just dump money into an 18-year-old grandchild's lap, that's probably the worst thing a grandparent could do. And you may very well be right. So if you decide to leave things to grandchildren, it should be left to them in a trust. Naming a trustee, maybe their parent, your child, or some other trustee, defining what the money can be used for while the child is still, in that becoming an adult age into their late teens, early 20s. Often, grandparents want to provide that the inheritance left in trust for the grandchildren can be used for education and can be used for other things and their standards. And so That's, if you're gonna leave it to the grandchildren, you can put restrictions on it so it's not used for the right reasons. It's a trustee oversees it until that grandchild is responsible and ready to handle it himself or herself. So the bottom line on whether you should just leave your estate to your children or carve out some for the grandchildren and leave the rest to your children, which is right, which is wrong. Here I'm going to be vague, but it's a personal decision. I'm going to go back and just repeat. The people who do typically leave things to the grandkids say either I want to acknowledge them, I want to provide for their education, I want them to get a head start on their life, or they might say our children will blow it if we leave it to our children, let's leave something to the grandchildren. The ones who don't leave it to the grandchildren and leave it to the kids are usually saying something like, I'm going to leave it to our kids, and our kids will make decisions on how they'll provide for their kids. Or they might say, we don't want our grandkids to blow it. We don't know our grandchildren well enough yet. We don't know how they will mature, and so we don't want to make a mistake. And other people rely on their personal experience. My grandparents didn't leave me anything. I'm not going to leave anything to my grandkids. So those are just things people say. But I kind of like the idea of carving out some for the grandkids. Here's an option, and I don't see this much. So instead of just saying in your estate planning documents, whether it's your will or your living trust, saying I'm leaving, or we, grandparents or grandparents, instead of saying I or we leave $50,000, $100,000 or more to each of our grandchildren when we die, maybe if you can afford it, maybe while they're young, and young is a relative term, but let's say they're 15 or they're 19, maybe you actually give them maybe $2,000 or $3,000 or $5,000 or whatever that amount is appropriate in your circumstance, and see what they do with it. Maybe you really like what they do with it. They invest it, or they use it to better themselves through education, or they save it. Or maybe when you give them $3,000, they go out and they buy a $5,000 toy. Well, that could give you an indication of whether you should leave them an inheritance when you pass away, potentially an even much larger inheritance. So that's just an option. So my question of the day is, what are your thoughts on whether you, if or when you have grandchildren, whether you feel it's appropriate in your circumstances or in your parents' or in your grandparents' circumstances to carve out something for the grandkids, or just leave it to the kids equally. So really, I think this is one of those areas where kind of the public can benefit from everybody's comments down below. So, think it through for a minute. Type in your comments below on whether grandparents should just leave it all to the kids, or whether they should carve out something for the grandkids, kind of why, and what your thoughts are about that, so we can get a discussion going, and then people can start making some really informed decisions about what they want to do with their estate. And these are important decisions because they're going to affect your family for the next not only one, and maybe not only two, but maybe the next 3 generations, or maybe more. So really important discussion, really important decision. And so, of course, my last piece of advice, make sure you click the subscribe button and the notification bell, punch the thumbs up button, give it a like, and then I really would, I'll read them, and to the extent, it's appropriate, I'll comment on them if that's appropriate. I don't want to give a lot of legal advice in the comments below, because sometimes I don't have the full picture from just somebody asking one question in a comment, and but I want to get a discussion going. So check that out. Should you just leave it to the kids, or should you carve out something, some amount, some small percentage to the grandkids, and then with the bulk going to the kids? Which is right, which is wrong, and kind of why you feel that way. That would help other people get things done. All right, I'm Paul Rabalais. Have a great day. Y'all take care.